cases that I cited, and I have the study for you. The teen pregnancy rate is, in one of these studies, they argue that the problem isn't teen pregnancy, that the problem is out-of-wedlock pregnancy, and that teen girls are actually getting pregnant at about the same rate that they were getting pregnant 35 years ago. We did have a decline for a while in the teen pregnancy rate. Just recently, and the stats are, we're always a couple years behind on the stats, but just recently in about 2006 or so, there's no bump back up in teen pregnancy rates. So
I don't want to go political on that, but I know some differences in the last two administrations here. I do have some other questions, but I think I'll hold off on that. Actually, I think Elaine will speak to some of the questions that I had, and I'll have you comment on them later also.
Great.
So thank you for being here, and welcome to. Don't go away.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kate is in the machine, so the Office of Legislative Management can take the meeting, so we're going to just take a little pause here until that tape goes on and start. Okay.
Should be all right now.
Oh, it's okay now?
Yeah. CJ set it up. Yeah.
Well, that was a brief pause. So we're starting again. Let me just again say that I want to again recognize Senator Gomes, who's here with us today from Great City of Bridgeport. My co-chair, our co-chair, Representative Bruce Morris. And as I was saying, we don't have a lot of the members of the committee, and we're trying to figure out why. We're thinking it may have something to do with an election going on. And that may help to determine when our next meeting is. We have to take a look and see whether we're scheduling at times that people can make it or not. Having said that, I do want to go through what's in the folders for our committee members. The last meeting minutes, which I do not think we're going to approve today because of the lack of a number of members of the committee. Also, we just received today, Susan Price did a OLR backgrounder on family composition. We just received it, so we're not going to be looking at that today or discussing that today. There's an article on unwanted pregnancies, cross troubling line. This was it was from the Hartford Courant last Saturday, and I'm going to mention that in my remarks a little bit later. But you may have a copy. You have the exact copy right out of the paper. It's from the Kansas City Star initially, which is we couldn't find it online, and that's why. We have a conference notification from the Connecticut Coalition for Child Development Education, preparing tomorrow's effective parents on October 7th, 2008, which is right here in the LOB from 1 to 3 p.m. And a briefing paper, which I think Elaine Zimmerman is going to be speaking to us about on the need for child development education for all students. Am I correct in that?
We've got packets here, so this may be something else.
Okay. Liz, who's this briefing paper from?
Liz Brown. It goes with the flyer.
Okay, Liz Brown from the...
There you go.
Okay, very good. So it goes along with Elaine's materials. Okay, very good. We do have a couple of distinguished guests today. And I do want to say something that in the future, we hope to have more people to speak to the committee. There are people in this audience I know who would like to have an opportunity to speak to the committee. And please approach us after the meeting about doing that and trying to schedule some time. We hope we can get you in this fall. That we'd like to, because people I know have been here in the sense of pay some dues, have come to meetings, and have a point of view that they want to express, and we would like to have those folks come. So please see us after the meeting about speaking to us, and speaking to the committee, and testifying in front of the committee. And we'll try to schedule that, as I said, as we go forward. I'm going to not get into any substantive issues at this point. Any further remarks, Representative?
Fantastic job, Senator.
It's a mutual admiration society here.
Thank everyone that is continuing to attend and stay focused on this issue. And we do have two fantastic presenters here today. But I do want to thank Susan Price on the background that she's given. I do have a question. I think at our last meeting, to the clerk and so they were asking if we could have this information and the minutes and things placed on the Children's Committee website. Liz, do you know who we're asking with that?
Yes. I've spoken to ITS, and I know what they're looking for from the two of you, and once I talk to you, I'll tell them, and they should be able to put it up quite quickly.
Great, fantastic. This is my understanding, especially talking to Liz, who's a fantastic clerk here with the Children's Committee, that there are a lot of people that are sending emails and information that they're concerned about the work of the task force and their ability to provide information to us. So it is our intent, it is our goal that for all the meetings we have here, that the minutes, whatever information provided to the task force, that we're able to provide that in some type of a format for the public at large to access via the web. And therefore be able to give us further input, really become part of the dialogue. We are trying currently to schedule the meeting. We know that the group of divorced dads have been very focused in their concerns, and we are trying to coordinate that meeting with judges and making certain we can hear the input of the divorced dads and really let the judges hear it at the same time. I know we've got a lot more divorced dads there as well today. So we encourage the public at large that has been responding to the viewing of CPN to continue to send your emails, to continue to let us know what your concerns are, your input. It will help us even determine how we're going to prioritize the meetings with different groups of dads, and even moms that are concerned about this subject. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. As Bruce mentioned, we have two distinguished speakers today. And the first speaker on our agenda is Peter Wolfgang. Peter, if you could come up and I'll do a little brief introduction. We're supposed to say something about those are the exits and use them in case there's a fire or something like that. Okay, I got the exact language down, but just look at it. I want to tell you something. If there's a fire, get out the doors, and if there's smoke in the room, crawl on the floor, because it's going to be up here and you'll be safe down there. One more intro?
Yeah, if I can. This is an important intro to do because as co-chairs, and the rest of the task force, we are very grateful to Speaker Amon that he saw the importance of this issue and determined to empower this task force. And he's continuing to stay vigilant and concerned about where it goes. So with that being done, he's going to the extent of giving a very special person in the state of Connecticut to kind of look for his end of things, and that's Heidi Boyd, our former Connecticut, Miss Connecticut, am I correct? So we're glad that she's here. So she's here on behalf of Speaker Raymond, even just following this and certainly having conversations with her. It's good to have another set of hands to help coordinate the work. We won't tell you, there's a very special guest that her and the speaker will be working on, hoping that we can get. I think the entire state would be interested in hearing that guest that we're able to get them. So thank you.
Very good. I hope I know who that guest is. My fingers are crossed. But we do have a guest right now in front of us, and that is Peter Wolfgang, a very distinguished representative from the Institute, Family Institute of Connecticut, which Peter joined as the Director of Public Policy in the year 2004 and became the Executive Director in 2007. Peter holds a Juris Doctorate from UConn School of Law and is a member of the Connecticut Bar. He also has a bachelor's degree in international studies from the American University of Washington, D.C. Peter is a family man. 1, 2, 3, 4 children.
Number 5 is due in February.
Congratulations. And I welcome you.
Thank you, Senator LeBeau. Good afternoon, Chairman LeBeau, Chairman Morris, and member of the committee of the task force. My name is Peter Wolfgang. I am the Executive Director of the Family Institute of Connecticut, an organization whose mission is to encourage and strengthen the family as the foundation of society and to promote sound ethical and moral values in our culture and government. I am happy to be here today to discuss with you the root causes of fatherlessness in Connecticut and potential remedies. Before I begin, though, I want to take a moment to congratulate you on the creation of this task force, and of course Speaker Amon as well. The decline of the two-parent traditional family over the last 40 years is one of the most significant social transformations in world history. Connecticut and the nation as a whole have seen the traditional fabric of social order torn asunder by high rates of divorce, fatherlessness, and other social pathologies. And while there are many efforts already underway to address these problems, this task force marks the first time, at least the first time that I'm aware of, where our state government has asked a simple question: how did we get here in the first place? Your willingness to ask that question struck a chord with Family Institute members, which is why they sent 5,022 emails to their legislators during the last session asking that this task force be formed. So, how did we get here? Before answering that question, we must understand where it is that we are. After adjusting for changes in population, statistics show that the divorce rate in Connecticut has more than tripled since 1960. The percentage of births to unmarried mothers has increased tenfold since 1960. The percentage of fatherless families has almost quadrupled since 1960. And nationally, the number of cohabitating couples increased from 439,000 in 1960 to 4.24 million by 1998, an almost tenfold increase. In the last 15 years, however, we have seen small improvements which show that family decline is not inevitable. By 2002, the divorce rate in Connecticut had declined 35% since its historic high point in 1979. The teen pregnancy rate declined over 19% since its historic high in 1989, and the rate of increase of both out-of-wedlock births and fatherlessness had slowed. We need a statewide commitment to furthering these improvements from the highest level of government down to our own families, and we need it from all sectors of society. Family Institute does not believe that social reforms designed to strengthen families must come primarily and exclusively from the public sector. This task force can serve a vital role in making recommendations not only to the legislature, but to community, business, and religious leaders about ways in which they can make positive contributions to the support of the family. Nevertheless, in light of the grave social emergency posed by the decline in the percentage of traditional families, there is an urgent need for a reorientation of public policy in the direction of legislation that is specifically designed to encourage and support traditional families in Connecticut. In previous meetings, this task force has already discussed the correlation between fatherlessness and an increase in crime, delinquency, drug abuse, poverty, depression, child abuse, early sexual activity, and other negative social trends. All of these statistics add up to another negative result for society, which ought to be a key concern of government. Fatherlessness is costing taxpayers a lot of money. 5 months ago, the Institute for American Values, and at the last meeting a month ago, there was a lot of discussion of David Blankenhorn. David Blankenhorn, of course, wrote the classic work on this, Fatherless America, which Chris Powell talked about at length, and I know it had a big impact on the co-chairman of this committee, and it definitely is a great guide for this. David Blankenhorn is one of the heads of the Institute for American Values, which I'll quote a few times during this testimony. 5 months ago, the Institute for American Values released a first-ever report quantifying a minimum $112 billion annual taxpayer cost from high rates of divorce and unmarried childbearing. And they broke it down by state. Here in Connecticut, they estimated that family decline, high rates of divorce, and unmarried childbearing are costing Connecticut taxpayers $712 million a year. These costs are due to increased taxpayer expenditures for anti-poverty, criminal justice, and education programs, and through lower levels of taxes paid by individuals whose adult productivity has been negatively affected by increased child poverty caused by family fragmentation. This shows that public concern about the decline of marriage need not be based only on moral concerns or, as was a primary concern of Chris Powell a month ago, reduction of crime, but that reducing high taxpayer costs of family fragmentation is a legitimate concern of government policymakers and legislators, also for financial reasons. And it is the decline of marriage that has led to the increase of fatherlessness in Connecticut. If we define a fatherless child as a child who does not have the opportunity to grow up in a home with his father, there's no more definitive explanation. It follows like night follows day. In order for there to be an increase in fatherlessness, if we define fatherlessness as not having the opportunity to grow up in a home with both your mom and dad, there must first be a decline in marriage. Single motherhood is a likely result when half of all marriages end in divorce. Unmarried childbearing increases the likelihood that a child will not be able to grow up in a home with his married mother and father. How did we get here in the first place? In part, it was because of the passage of no-fault divorce laws. Last year, the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy released a study on whether the divorce law affects the divorce rate. Most of their research showed that it did increase the divorce rate, by one estimate, as much as 88%, but more typically on the order of 10%. Interestingly, their research did show that the effect of no-fault divorce laws, the passage of no-fault divorce laws, on the overall divorce rate appears to fade with time. I find that interesting because, as I have already noted, the divorce rate in Connecticut peaked in 1979. Connecticut passed its no-fault divorce law in 1973. Our no-fault divorce reform has, in effect, created unilateral divorce. Either spouse can dissolve a marriage at any time for any reason, regardless of what the other spouse wants. This evolution of state law was succinctly described by Dennis E. Powell in National Review in 2003. Quote, "As long as either party wants a divorce for any reason, or for no reason at all, then divorce it will be. The law insists on dissolution of marriage whenever divorce is proposed. The governing case, as the Do-It-Yourself Divorce Guide offered on Connecticut's judicial website so helpfully points out, is Eversman versus Eversman, in which a Connecticut appeals court found that the fact that the defendant maintains hope for reconciliation will not support a finding that there are prospects for a reconciliation. A divorce, to be irreconcilable, need not necessarily be so viewed by both parties. The effect is to transform divorce from the last resort, as it was before Connecticut passed Public Act 73-373 in 1973, into the first choice. Interestingly, commentary published on the new law at its passage suggests that the no-fault provision was added for those who agreed to divorce. Eversman made short work of that notion." Unquote. Another notable cause of fatherlessness is the increase in out-of-wedlock childbearing. A 1999 study from the Institute for American Values, again that's David Blankenhorn's institute, notes that what we have called our teen pregnancy crisis is not really about teenagers, nor is it really about pregnancy. It is about the decline of marriage. The study says that women having their first child during their teen years was about the same in the early 1970s as it was by 1999. What changed was the declining proportion of pregnant single teens who marry. The majority of unwed births in the United States today are to adult women in their 20s. These are not children having children, nor are they Murphy Browns. Asks the study, why do so many women today find unwed motherhood either easier to arrange than early marriage or preferable to early marriage? The first thing to notice is that today's adults seem to be saying remarkably little about these particular issues. Often they say nothing at all. For example, most teen pregnancy initiatives concentrate almost exclusively on how teens should behave before they get pregnant, typically focusing on encouraging teens either to postpone sex or use contraceptives. But once a girl or young woman is actually expecting a child, adult guidance from the larger community, particularly regarding marriage and adoption, frequently disappears. There are no formal efforts that espouse legitimization of a child by a marriage when conception occurs out of wedlock. So, what is to be done? What policies might reverse the decline in marriage and the resulting increase in fatherlessness? Medical ethics teaches the rule, first, do no harm. That's a good starting point. The no-fault divorce revolution of the 1970s has done considerable harm to families and children. It should be repealed. But politics, of course, is the art of the possible, and we won't hold our breath waiting for that to happen. Still, the do no harm principle applies. Whenever a bill is passed that will cost money, a fiscal note must be attached to it. We ought to have something similar so that no legislation can be passed without considering the impact on families. To this end, proposed legislation which may have a significant impact upon families should be accompanied by a family impact statement that will explain the direct and indirect effects of the proposed policy on families in Connecticut. Second, pass a marriage education law. This is a law saying that the marriage license fee will be reduced if the couple takes a marriage education course that will improve their chances of staying married. I have model legislation on this, which I'll give you after my testimony. Marriage education is informed by research suggesting that a healthy, happy marriage involves skills that can be taught. Marriage education is skills education, not therapy, and can be offered by a wide variety of practitioners as well as trained community volunteers. Marriage education comes in different forms, but most programs have a substantial focus on offering couples practical instruction on how to manage conflict in constructive ways. Premarital education typically includes inventories or questionnaires that help couples identify strengths and problem areas in communication before making a marriage commitment. Three popular versions include Prepare, Focus, and Prep. Almost 200 cities and communities throughout the United States have community agreements or covenants in which clergy commit to encouraging requiring marriage education and waiting period before marrying couples. Marriage Savers on their website has a lot of information on this. I've included their website in my testimony. Marriage educators also offer divorce interventions for distressed married couples. Two excellent programs include Pairs, Practical Applications of Intimate Relationships, and Retrobail, offered through the Catholic Church but open to anyone. Third, if we cannot repeal no-fault divorce, let's at least pass a covenant marriage law. Covenant marriage offers couples who marry the choice of making a more substantial legal commitment in marriage than the standard no-fault marriage contract permits. Louisiana, Arkansas, and Arizona have passed covenant marriage legislation. Generally, a covenant marriage requires 1. Premarital counseling by a minister or other competent professional about the nature of marriage as a serious lifelong commitment, as well as the legal obligations of a covenant marriage. 2. A legally enforceable obligation to take all reasonable steps to preserve the marriage if marital difficulties arise. And 3. Somewhat restricted grounds for legal separation, the latter usually available after the lapse of a longer waiting period without alleging fault. Personally, I'd love to see the no-fault divorce law from the 70s repealed, but this at least, something like a covenant marriage law, puts the ball in the courts of the couples who want to get married. I mean, they don't have to if they don't want to, but it creates the opportunity for them, if they so choose, to enter into a more strictly legally binding version of marriage. Fourth, have teen pregnancy prevention programs that encourage marriage or adoption if the program itself fails and the young woman becomes pregnant. While the contraception versus abstinence debate rages on, the question of what comes next if the girl does become pregnant, as already noted in one of the studies that I've mentioned, goes largely unaddressed. And I have several of these studies that I'll give you as soon as I'm done here that I've cited. The Taxpayer Costs of Divorce and Unwed Childbearing from David Blankenhorn's Institute. This is the one, and it breaks it down in more detail than I can give in a brief speech. But they estimate $712 million annually cost to the taxpayers in Connecticut because of family fragmentation. The model marriage education legislation that I spoke of, I have that for you. I mentioned covenant marriage. I didn't mention that I also have model legislation from that. It's passed in 3 states. I have Louisiana's. I referenced a study, again, from Institute for American Values, David Blankenhorn's Institute, getting into the topic of teen pregnancy and where teen pregnancy prevention programs fall short, their lack of any emphasis on what to do after you become pregnant. I have that study as well. I quoted an article from National Review about the divorce laws in Connecticut. I have that article. I quoted a study on does divorce law affect the divorce rate. I think this is a very important study, although, again, politics is the art of the possible, and the repeal of no-fault divorce probably isn't going to happen. Nevertheless, I think this makes for very important reading moving forward in terms of understanding, how do we not fall into that again? How do we take a broader look at how our legislation we pass will impact families in the future. I also have something that the Family Institute, a study we did a few years ago called The State of the Family in Connecticut. Much of the statistics that I began with came from that, about where things were in Connecticut in 1960 versus where they are now. And, you know, in conclusion, I want to follow up on something that Senator LeBeau said a month ago, because it's so important, and I strongly agree with it. He was expressing his own agreement with David Blankenhorn, which is that ultimately these problems can't really be solved by government. I mean, government has a role to play, but Blankenhorn said it, and I know Senator LeBeau agrees, and I agree as well, that it's cultural. Ultimately, these are cultural problems. What the government can do is first, again, that principle from medical ethics, first do no harm. I think some sort of family impact statement, you know, like the fiscal notes that we attach to our bills. What does this mean? How will this affect families? I think would be important. But Senator LeBeau cited Blankenhorn during our meeting last month in a way that I strongly agree with, in that even though these problems are first and foremost cultural, government were the script writers for our culture. Government are like the screenwriters. For movies, for television, government, that phrase, screenwriters, governments are the screenwriters. They help teach what the cultural norms are. So I think some sort of family impact statement, taking a closer look at that, and also some of the other options that I mentioned. In Family Institute, we have a working relationship with about 150 churches in the state of Connecticut that are doing a variety of work. We're very excited about this task force, and anything that we can do to help build up healthy marriage in Connecticut and thereby lessen the possibility of our children in the state growing up in a home without a father is something we'd be happy to support. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your very constructive criticism and commentary and suggestions. I think this is some very good suggestions here. We're going to ask a couple of questions right now, and then we're going to hoping you to be able to stay a while and listen to Elaine Zimmerman. And then we're going to let Elaine make some presentation. We'll ask her some questions. We may allow you guys to have a little dialogue in terms of where you agree and where you disagree. In terms of the ideas you presented, the ideas that Elaine's going to be presenting. And I'm very impressed with the positive nature of what you just presented to us. I did want to ask a couple of questions. Make a comment. An article I passed out to the members of the committee, which is called, which I mentioned, Pregnancies Cross Troubling Line. I actually mentioned it at the last meeting because I'd heard it on the radio, but I hadn't seen it in print. This was in the Hartford Current last Saturday. And it's from a Kansas City Star article from the McClatchy newspapers. And in that article, talking about the cost of, they mentioned the same figure you mentioned, $120 billion, $112 billion annual taxpayer expense. They, of course, did not mention the Connecticut specific cost. They also mentioned there was approximate cost of $7,000 per year per child. If you break that down to the taxpayers for an unwed child, for the child of an unwed or a parent or a father, having no father in the family, not unwed. And as well, when you're talking about David Blankenhorn, one of the guests we're hoping to have here, we've been in contact since the last meeting with his office and the Institute for American Values, and we're in the process of trying to find a date a month from now to have him come. So it's a matter of what day we're going to be available and he's going to be available. And so we do look at him as an authority on this. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. You said that divorce peaked in 1979. Do you have some numbers on that in terms of, or is that in the material that you have?
It is in the material that I have, and I can probably send further information along if there's not enough on it.
I'm just curious what the rate was in Connecticut and what the rate is today.
I can get that information for you.
that article I was referring to also, you talked about the increase in, and you talked about the increase in out-of-wedlock childbearing. And it's in that article where they cite the number for women who are having children, women under 30 and under who are having children, that 50.4% of those births are now out of wedlock. And that is an increase from like 6%, you go back to 1960, there's an increase from 6% in 1960. So this is an increasing problem. And this is probably, when we talk about divorce, I think this is becoming more of a problem in terms of the absolute numbers for children not having fathers, because they never had one to begin with.
Right.
As opposed to having the divorce problem and the separation of the family.
If we were having this conversation as recently as 10 years ago, I think almost the entire conversation would be about divorce, but the out-of-wedlock childbearing is just beginning to dwarf the other cause of marital decline.
I'm interested in your covenant marriage idea. And you mentioned that it was passed in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Arizona.
Yes.
Do we have any results from those states? And that's something we can research too.
There's been...
do you have any idea how long, to go back, how long the effectiveness of that program and how long it's been in existence?
Right, well this is the problem, is that it is fairly new. It only goes back about 10 years or so, so longitudinal studies aren't really available yet. Preliminary information is positive. I mean, of the 3 states that passed it, I recall that 2 of them had positive results and 1 did not. So it's mixed at this point. I wish I could give you a silver bullet, oh yeah, this is working exactly as we had hoped. And there's, I know one of the 3 states, there was a very low number of participants, and I think that made it hard for them to gauge how well it was working, because there were so few people that took advantage of it.
Sample size.
Right, sample size. I'm not a social scientist myself, so I'm not familiar with all the methodology, but they felt like there wasn't enough there to work with to gauge the results yet.
But it would be interesting if the other 2 states did have large enough sample sizes to be, and a statistician can figure out what the sample size has to be, to compare those who are getting traditional marriages versus those who are in a covenant marriage. And if it's been running for 10 years, to compare those 2 groups and to see how those 2 groups are comparing, in a sense, over that period of time. That data should be available.
And the wonderful thing about it is that it's voluntary. I mean, if you're someone who doesn't share my view that no-fault divorce is a bad thing and ought to be repealed, you can still get on board with covenant marriage, because it just puts the ball back in the courts of the couples themselves. I mean, the same way couples, if they want to, could choose to have a prenuptial agreement prior to getting married, but they don't have to have a prenuptial agreement. This is just another legal option that they could exercise if they wish to show a higher level of commitment, of legal commitment, if they so choose, to the permanence of their marriage. And if they choose not to, if they, for whatever reason, or they don't think it's the government's business, or, well, then it's up to them.
That appeals to me also, because it is, as you're saying, it is voluntary. The other point I wanted to make is the family impact statement. That was originally proposed by Jimmy Carter back in 1978 or 79, and I know it's been proposed in legislation in the state of Connecticut. I know because I believe I proposed it among others. It's just a point to make that it has an enormous fiscal impact in terms of having to have staff who would research that and the databases that are needed. And on the other hand, right, the question is the value of that versus what's going on today. The value of that in terms of educating the public, and as you allude to. So I just wanted to note that in the past we haven't seen that as important enough to make a priority to make that part of our legislative process. But there are those who, and as a matter of fact, I would think that most legislators would agree with it. It's just a matter of finding the dollars to put it in there and making it a priority to make sure that it's part of the legislative budget, which is part of the larger budget.
If that should come up again, Family Institute, we would get on board. We would support it. I mean, this is what happens when you when you want to pass a bill at the legislature. It's on us, those of us who are advocacy groups out there to do the research and find out, make a case for why it deserves to be passed, and then try to make that case to those of you in the legislature. So I mean, we would certainly be willing to look into some of the legwork for. Would it be cost effective? Would it, whatever it would cost, would it still be dwarfed by that $712 million that David Blankenhorn's group says family decline is costing Connecticut every year?
And how much would it have a positive impact on lowering that, which would be very difficult to figure out at the same time. Which raises the issue of if these would, I'm sure that if you're proposing a tax bill on whatever, gasoline, or reduced taxes on gasoline, family impact statement on that, it's going to be rather difficult to figure out. I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
We can take, if it goes down a few cents, does that mean we can take more family trips?
Right.
Or does that allow individuals to take off and do their own thing? I don't know. So I think there's a real difficulty in also not only just the cost, but in how does one then figure those, really flesh that out in terms of what the statements would be. And I'm not sure who you even hire to do that, whether there's enough sociologists or anthropologists perhaps to have those kinds of answers and then relate that back to dollars also. So, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. And thank you, Peter. All the research, all the data and things you've brought to us here today. I think, again, you stress the importance of this issue when we start taking a look at the type of statistics that you cited today. I have a few questions, and some of them I may appear to be the devil's advocate the way I ask them, okay? But I think you understand where I'm at, but I'm trying to get an understanding of a few things. Number one, the study that you cited was about the $712 million per year that is costing the state of Connecticut taxpayers because of the cost of divorce and those who are childbearing out of wedlock. That information, is it disaggregated based on those who are divorced as opposed to those who are single and out of wedlock? Is there a comparison that's given?
There isn't.
Is the general number?
Yeah, divorce and unwed childbearing are lumped together. They don't break it down between the two.
Okay. Well, certainly thank you for associating with us the fact that the rate peaked in 1979 when our law came into place in 1973 when we passed the law for no-fault divorces. Now, you said peak. What was the approximate percentage that it jumped within that very short amount of time, 6 years?
Right. Senator LeBeau just asked me a similar question, and I regret that I don't have that. I will get that for you.
Okay. And, all right, since 79, help me because you have the numbers, and maybe you can look at this a little closer than I am. And since 79, the number of divorces has, what, 4 times, am I correct? It's quadrupled?
Yes. Divorce rate in Connecticut, it's more than tripled. Hasn't quite hit quadrupled yet.
Okay. And what you stated earlier is that the decline of marriage is the cause of fatherlessness. Is that the sum total of what you're presenting here today?
That's I think everything pivots on that. I think I think it's virtually impossible. And again, I think to some extent, you remember when we had the very first meeting. It was a non-meeting meeting. We had the press conference upstairs, and then we came down here, and it was just sort of a an organizational meeting. And I spoke at the time where I said that I don't think you can have a task force to study the root causes of fatherlessness and not have a conversation about marriage and about the sort of things that I was then able to present to you today about the stunning decline of marriage, both in terms of the relationship of marriage to childbearing, both in terms of divorce and in terms of out-of-wedlock childbearing. But how do we define fatherlessness? At that first meeting, the organizational meeting, I got the impression from some of the speakers that maybe their understanding of fatherlessness is a little different than mine. They seem to define fatherlessness versus having a father by the extent to which a father is involved in the child's life. Well, if that's your definition, then that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, traditionally, I think in layman's terms, for most people, when you're talking about fatherlessness, you're talking about not being able to grow up in a home with your dad. I would say that colloquially, that's how most people would define fatherlessness. And then if that's the case, then I think it follows that you can't have the sort of rise in fatherlessness. There's a correlation that we've seen this rise in fatherlessness at the same time that we've seen the other things that I presented. The increase in divorce, the increase in out-of-wedlock childbearing, it logically follows that many of these children, as a result, many more than before these trends, are consequently not growing up in a home with their father.
Okay, and not to dismiss the value of having a father in a home as a result of a marriage. However, I think since the 1980s, there's been some research done, and probably Lane Zimmerman will probably bring some of this forward, that has a lot to do with just the value of having a loving male figure in the home, preferably the biological dad. All right. With throwing that kind of information out there, how does that would that change or affect your position, particularly in today's society? And I understand the moral values
I understand what you're saying.
The Connecticut promotes. We are in a society today where we have a lot of people who are cohabiting, and you gave us some statistics about the number of people who cohabit, and how lengthy that commitment is. It's almost as bad as marriage today.
It is. I mean, the stats show that it is still much worse than marriage, even with divorce. That these couples are less likely to stay together, or if they cohabit prior to marriage, I mean, contrary to popular wisdom, they're actually more likely to divorce. Your question to me about, well, what about just a loving male presence as opposed to the father? You know, I necessarily limited my testimony because I could have gone on all day and no one would have liked that, I'm sure. But
well, that's why we're digging a little deeper. That was good.
But in limiting my testimony, what I choose to pull out was stuff that I felt from being at the previous meeting a month ago was already kind of a given that this task force seemed already to agree on and seemed almost to be part of the reason for the creation of the task force to begin with. All those things that were discussed with Chris Powell a month ago about how fatherlessness, in a month before that or 2 months before that when we had the initial press conference, how fatherlessness necessarily leads to these, or seems to lead to these, this increase in all these negative statistical indicators. You're more likely to experiment with drugs, to commit a crime, to go to prison, to drop out of school, to have an out-of-wedlock child yourself. Those correlations, I mean, if you look at the, and I chose not to make that a centerpiece of my speech because it had already been covered, but the sources from which we gather that information do not tell us that as long as you have just some loving male presence, you're going to be okay. I mean, those sources say that it's because of fatherlessness, that there's a direct link between fatherlessness, or there appears to be a correlation, you know, to the extent that social science can say anything firmly, that there appears to be a correlation between specifically fatherlessness and these increase in these social indicators. I've not seen studies that say, well, just a loving male presence is just as good as having your married biological mom and dad.
So certainly the biological parent is the ideal
yes.
In any of the studies that have been done.
And I think
having both of them.
there's a lot of wisdom even in the name of the task force, in the proposed bill, and I think it is in the name of this task force, that it is a task force on fatherhood or on studying the causes of fatherlessness in Connecticut. It's not a task force on studying the absence of a loving male presence in the lives of children in the state of Connecticut. There's already a very strong implicit wisdom in the name of the task force and in the legislation that was introduced to create it.
Thank you for the recommendation, that you gave us in terms of the covenant marriage law. It's the first time I heard of it. But if we were to only consider how we strengthen marriages and those who are going to be married, but yet there are other external factors in society that affect your marriage, even after you've had the counseling and you've done all these things. How would we assure that in itself would enable us to have dads who are engaged in their kids' lives? Because it's one thing to have, he was a father in the home. I imagine there are a lot of homes where the dads are there, yet they're not engaged in their children's lives, and that's where we get the real value.
Well, at this point, I think some of and probably perhaps Elaine Zimmerman could speak to this more than me, but there are fatherhood initiatives that are already out there to try to help with situations like that. I think not only for people in very difficult situations, people who are in prison or whatever, but fatherhood in general, to increase father involvement in the lives of children. And some of those programs are very, very worthy. What's unique and special about this task force, and I said this to the Committee on Children, to Senator Meyer when I testified in favor of its creation, is, and I think I said it today, is that it fills a niche by looking at the root causes and asking, how did we get here to begin with? But, what you say is very true. That there are other forces in society that work against marriage, that work against fatherhood. Unfortunately, and I so strongly agree with both David Blankenhorn and Senator LeBeau on this, ultimately it does come down to culture. Everything does come down to culture. When the media glorifies anything that isn't marriage, when they attack marriage in some way, when pop culture praises marital infidelity or anything as something attractive in traditional marital commitments, as something dour or unsatisfying, that sends a message to our culture as a whole.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will probably have some other questions, but I'll address you later after we have Elaine Zimmerman. I'll defer to Representative Clemens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Wolfgang. Thank you for your testimony this afternoon. Very informative. A couple of questions, if I may, and I apologize if one might be redundant to Representative Morris' question, but it pertains to when you articulated the $712 million that's costing taxpayers here in Connecticut for family fragmentation. Could you be more definitive as to what defines family fragmentation and what that $712 million represents or constitutes?
Well, in regards to your second question, I can't be more definitive than the study itself, and I will make it a point to give this task force a copy of that study. So in terms of breaking down the $712 million, they say that these costs are due to increased taxpayer expenditures for anti-poverty, criminal justice, and education programs, and through lower levels of taxes paid by individuals whose adult productivity has been negatively affected by increased child poverty caused by family fragmentation. And they go into more detail about that. You asked what defines family fragmentation. The study defines it as divorce and unwed childbearing.
And you also stated that 50% of all marriages ends in divorce. Is that a national percentage? And if so, does that same percentage reflect here in Connecticut, or is it higher or lower here in Connecticut?
It is a national percentage, and I regret, third time now, I regret that I should have had those exact percentages for you in terms of where we were in 1979 and where we are today, because I talked earlier about how it peaked in 79, and it should have occurred to me that someone would have asked specifically, well, what do you mean by that? I'll get you those numbers. I do want to say that the 50% statistic is national. I should say, too, that it's hotly disputed. There are folks who say that that the percentage is actually lower, that when you control for just first marriages, that a lot of the 50% comes from second and third marriages that end in divorce. And that when you control for just first marriages, and this is one thing that's true both nationally and in Connecticut, is that the divorce rate was climbing, peaked at some point, and then started holding steady. And a lot of people point to this this breaking down of the 50% statistic between first marriages and later marriages, that if you control for just first marriages, for all the doom and gloom, and there's a lot of it out there, marriage is actually a little bit on the upswing in America from where it was about 15 years ago.
Any further questions, members of the committee?
If I can, just a follow-up to the reason we did the no-fault divorce law in Connecticut. My understanding is because, and I'd be maybe an expert, so please help me get a different understanding, because the courts were clogged up. They're being backlogged because there's a high number of divorces, and it looked like there was a trending towards divorce in the state and the country at that time. And people were spending an awful lot of money on divorce lawyers. So it kind of makes me think that there was still something else that was going on. I mean, we found a way to make it easier, less costly. So certainly that would give us research and data that would bring us a number. You said that we increased by 80% the number of divorces, because now we're actually moving through the courthouse faster, which could be the rationale for the high spike, but not that these people weren't going to divorce anyway. And if that were the case, wouldn't that suggest that there's something else inherently flawed in our society, or something? Because we talked in our last meeting, we were there, about this commitment, just social commitment in general, with kids, whether it's being committed to education, what motivates us. Just want to get your thoughts on that. Because statistically, I'm kind of thinking that could be a reason why we jumped to 8%.
Yeah. I'm about halfway with you on what you're saying, Representative Morris. There already was an uptick in divorce around the early 70s, and it did have to do with other things that were happening in our culture. We had the mass marketing, the invention and the mass marketing of the birth control pill. There was a sexual revolution. There was all sorts of other things happening in our culture in the 60s and 70s. I don't know that the argument at the time was necessarily, at least I never came across this, that they were saying we need this because the courts are clogged up. I think most of what I've read suggests that the courts are far more clogged up now than they were then. Maybe they did think that it was clogged up then, but I think it's probably far more clogged up now. But one rationale that I've come across over and over again, and this frankly is what I was taught down the street at UConn Law School in family law by a very brilliant professor who's on the opposite of me politically and everything, but is a very good authority on this. And this is what I've come across, is that no-fault divorce, one of the main arguments for no-fault divorce was that because you only had fault divorce, if a couple wanted to get out of a marriage, it was necessary for the man to lie. That's typically, that was viewed as an act of gallantry, as a gentlemanly thing to do, that a man who was really in many ways an upstanding citizen would get up and testify and say that he cheated on his wife or something, even if he didn't, just so that they could get out of the marriage, and that was some sort of level of hypocrisy. And if we had no-fault divorce, this would be so much better. It'd be liberating for the couples and for the children. You shouldn't keep them in unhappy marriages. Everyone will be happier. By about the 90s, there were longitudinal studies to show that a lot of the promised liberation and increased happiness that would come out of no-fault divorce didn't turn out as we had hoped. But that was the language, and a lot of it came out of Legal Reform Institute. I mean, you may be familiar with ALI. I think it is the American Law Institute. There were institutes that are very heavily respected in the law that make recommendations, to bodies like yours, to state legislatures about how the law should be changed in order to have a better, more fulfilling society. And ALI made those recommendations based partly on this argument that there's less hypocrisy, everyone will be happier. By about the 90s, those sorts of arguments were in disrepute.
Well, thank you. That's probably a good segue. I know my coach here has a couple more questions, but that last point that you gave will probably be a good segue into when we do the introduction for Elaine Zimmerman. When we think in terms of an earlier comment that you talked about in terms of teenage pregnancies and the adults and their involvement in it, as we consider what happened, the social climate during the 60s and certain values and things. So you'll hear me kind of go back to that a little later, because I think there may be a connection there we need to take a look at in terms of other state policy that may be affecting those areas.
So, thank you. I just want to pursue the part of your testimony that actually Representative Clemens and Representative Morris have also talked about. You have more data, but I think we got the gist of it in terms of the direction of it, and we don't have the exact numbers, but do you think it's just a statistical artifact that divorce declined over the last 15 years, or do you think it may have to be that those people didn't get married to begin with? And there's some other positive trends you cite. Teen pregnancy rate declined, and maybe I should just ask that and then get your ideas as to why the teen pregnancy rate also declined. So why don't you, why is the divorce rate declined? Because we haven't done anything, as far as I know. Major action on divorce. We haven't changed the laws.
Well, the government, when you say we, we're talking mostly about the government.
Exactly.
Churches have stepped up. I mean, a lot of this has to do with non-governmental organizations that have gotten involved, that have seen the crisis. There's a great book, probably about maybe 10 years old now, but I think still very authoritative, called The Great Disruption by Francis Fukuyama. And you may remember the name from, around the time of the Cold War. He wrote a book called The End of History, saying that, liberal capitalism is won and history is over, and it was very widely and, in my opinion, properly panned. But he wrote this other book called The Great Disruption, where he's a social scientist, and he looked at the history of civilizations, and he saw what he felt was a trend about it, and this was talking about the 60s and 70s and why things had leveled off since the 90s, that it's not unusual for civilizations sometimes to go through periods of great social disruption and to rally, to realize what they're doing, and to blink and to pull back. He argued that the 1920s was supposed to be the 1960s, that a lot of the things that today we associate with the 60s were already beginning in the 20s, coming off of World War I, that there were a lot of social trends that today we associate with the 60s, but then we got hit with the Great Depression, we got hit with World War II, so there was this great interruption in a social disruption that was already coming because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the modern era, that it began in the 20s, got disrupted because of some world crises, and then resumed again with a vengeance in the 60s and 70s. He also pointed to Victorian England as another example of this, where there was, and you read this in Dickens' books and so forth, about terrible social decline caused by the Industrial Revolution. But in the Victorian era, in the 1890s, there was this reformation of manners that had a lot to do with the churches, because society...
Let me summarize. You're kind of saying the pendulum swing.
Yes.
Or swung.
By about